So, biscuits. We've got a retraction here, I think, Flash.
Yeah, it was a mini retraction, quite a nice one, actually. This is Stephen tells this story about someone he thinks it's the Duke of Devonshire, and which you can hear in the recording, and it ends up with the punchline, "Good heavens, can't a man have a biscuit?" Somebody writing under the name Larry Lovage told us that this story comes from Nico Henderson's book Mandarin, which is a book of reminiscences. And in fact, it was a story told to him by the Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, and that they were actually talking about Lord Chandos and not Andrew Devonshire on this occasion. But I thought a nice little mini retraction.
Well, on biscuits, I did a bit of research on biscuits, which are quite interesting. Right up until the mid-18th century, the correct spelling for biscuit was B-I-S-K-E-T, biscuit. And in Dr. Johnson's dictionary, under biscuit, it says see biscuit. And I expect many people know, a biscuit, it comes from the French meaning twice cooked. But in French, un biscuit is not a biscuit, but a cake. Did you know that?
Good heavens.
Yeah. And in fact, another thing is that most biscuits weren't cooked twice. They were, according again to Dr. Johnson's dictionary, the biscuits they ate on ships, sea biscuits, were generally cooked 4 times. I suppose it kept them from going off, I don't know.
I think they must have been quite crunchy by the time they finished that.
Well, it is very odd, this thing, because in North America, biscuits are kind of scones, really, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely.
And what we call biscuits, they call cookies or crackers. Baboons. Yes, a flange of baboons. This comes from the famous, not the 9 o'clock news sketch, Gerald the Gorilla, where Mel Smith's character playing the professor is asked whether Gerald missed his friends in the jungle, and Mel Smith says, yes, of course, in the old days. He did try to contact his old flange of gorillas, and Gerald gets very annoyed and says, it's a whoop, Professor, a whoop. It's a flange of baboons, for God's sake. And this now appears to have actually entered the English language, at least if the Oxford English Dictionary online is anything to go by. Ask Oxford, where it appears as a collective noun for baboons. We are very sceptical, aren't we, John, about collective nouns at QI?
Well, only insofar as the only time you ever see them are in lists of collective nouns, and they tend not to have made it through into the language generally. And even if you go back to a lot of medieval sources, you find that they're again, it's just lists of murders of crows and.
I think it was done as a joke. There was a book, wasn't there, in sort of 1340 or something, of hunting terms.
Yeah.
But I really question...
That's the source from which all subsequent ones come, is it?
Not all, but a very large number.
Really,
of them.
yeah.
An unkindness of ravens. I mean, it's
Parliament of Owls.
Well, has anybody ever been in a wood and said, good Lord, there's an actual Parliament of Owls? I mean, in the first place, owls are rather solitary, aren't they, generally?
Yeah.
Do you ever see more than 2 at once?
No.
Possibly not. But we do know that the tuit-tu means that there are 2 there, don't we? That was the male and females, male calling and females answering.
But what's normally claimed for these things is that they're technical terms used by gamekeepers and hawkers, people like that. So we don't think even that's true.
Well, I think there are things like a wedge of teal or a raft of shell duck or something like that. There definitely are some technical things, but the unkindness of ravens or a number of accountants or a lot of auctioneers.
And all that. Those jokes, clearly. Any reason etymologically why, flock and herd and things like that are differentiated between sheep and cows and different animals?
Good question, Flash. Good question.
Very good. We'd like to know. Please write to us at www.qi.com.
Why does it sound so odd if you say there's a herd of sheep and people, to the point where people might laugh at you for it, or there's a flock of, cattle?
Well, do you think it's a bit similar to sort of the maybe Anglo-Saxon versus sort of Norman, that there might be different...
the beef boeuf.
Yes, that kind of...
Yeah.
Cow, beef.
Cattle, yes.
Cattle, that kind of thing.
Don't know.
Who knows?
We'd like to know.
Yes, very good. If anybody wants to look up collective nouns, your best source is the Book or Boke of St Albans from 1486. You can probably Google that and you'll see a few things about that there. Right, we've called this section Bronte, which will become clear towards the end of the discussion. We're talking about Nelson's eye patch. He was actually an incredibly unpopular guy, Nelson, with his fellow admirals. An awful lot of them refused to come to his funeral, for example. Earl St Vincent, who was, I think he was probably his boss at one stage, said, "Animal courage was the sole mark of Lord Nelson, his private character, disgraceful in every sense of the word." Nelson lost his right eye at Calvi in Corsica and his right arm at Santa Cruz in Tenerife. But the irony is that on both occasions he was actually on dry land. He wasn't actually on the ship at all, probably doing some sort of raid. And he was always ill, poor old Nelson. He was continually suffered from seasickness. He was a very bad sailor in that way, and he had malaria. And there have been some quite interesting recent research saying that he was a war criminal, quite ruthless, they claim. That in the 18 months, for example, he was captain of HMS Boreas, he ordered 54 of his 122 seamen and 12 of his 20 marines flogged, which is an astounding 47% of the men aboard.
But he was brave.
He was brave, and he was
three Victoria Crosses. They reckon if under
if they'd existed.
If they'd existed,
he's an extraordinary guy. My dad was in the Navy for almost 40 years, and when I discovered, you know, that thing that he might not have said "kiss me, Hardy," but it might have been kismet, meaning fate. And I said to my father, "Oh, this is a brilliant thing. Well, do you think it really was?" He said, "Kismet, Hardy. It sounds much more dignified." And my father said, no, Nelson was a very odd little man. Very odd.
But you know what he did say, what his last words were?
Well, just before you go on that, the other thing is apparently that kismet is not used in which is an Arabic word, is not used, or Persian or something, isn't used in Europe for about 40 years after Nelson's death. So
That's very good, Flash. I didn't know that.
So it hadn't made that journey. It's thought to have been a really Victorian attempt to make him look a bit less of a pansy.
It's not really very complicated, because there were lots of eyewitnesses, and Hardy kissed him twice when he was on his deathbed. And
did they go on holiday together?
Once on the cheek and once on the forehead, as Nelson struggled to remain conscious. And Nelson asked his flag captain not to throw him overboard, which is, I guess, always a risk if you're a dead sailor, and to look after poor Lady Hamilton, of which more in a moment. And he then muttered the immortal words. After Hardy's first kiss, he said, "Now I am satisfied." After the second, he said, "Who is that?" And then when he saw it was Hardy, he croaked, "God bless you, Hardy." And then shortly afterwards, he muttered, "Thank God I've done my duty." And then, "Drink, drink, fan, fan, rub, rub."
The famous last words of Admiral Lord Nelson.
Which we cover in the show, I think.
We do, yeah.
But, John, you saying he said all the other admirals hated him, and that could be, for a wealth of reasons, but was he popular with the crew?
Yes, he was.
So how come he was flogging them all?
Well, I don't think he did it all the time. I think, he was probably an off day, or maybe they were, a bad lot.
Maybe they deserved it.
Very possibly. But he famously, or perhaps not famously, if you just think of him as a war hero rather than a bit of a bastard, in June 1799 he executed 99 prisoners of war in Naples.
Made it very unpopular.
After the local British commander had guaranteed their safety. So that was a really rotten thing to do. But he did actually get the Neapolitan Order of St. Ferdinand for that, for executing these 99 rebels. So somebody was happy about it.
So what about Patrick Brunty? He was an admirer.
Well, yes, in the country, he had an enormous number of fans, including this Yorkshireman called Brunty, hence the title of this little thread, who changed his name to Bronte because the same guy, the King of Naples, who gave him the Neapolitan Order of St. Ferdinand, also created Nelson the Duke of Bronte. And this bloke, Brunty, who became Bronte, had some descendants who were the Bronte sisters. A rather interesting connection.
Had daughters, I think.
Anyway, while Nelson was in Naples, he started having his famous affair with Lady Hamilton, who was the wife of Sir William Hamilton, the British ambassador. And she'd been had a bit of a ropey early career. Her father was a blacksmith, and then she became a teenage prostitute in London. So she lucked out marrying Sir William, who himself was a fantastically eccentric person. His favourite thing when he was British ambassador to Naples was to go up to the rim of the crater of Vesuvius, where he picnicked naked, lunching on roasted pigeon, roasted on the lava from the volcano.
You want to be careful where you sat, wouldn't you, in that situation? I mean, not on a pigeon, for example.
Anyway, the last thing is tying this all up together. And in 1805, just before he set sail for the Battle of Trafalgar, Nelson went out and bought 4 large silver stars for £1 each, and for a further 25 shillings, I think he had a copy of the Neapolitan Order of St. Ferdinand made and had them sewn onto his uniform. So he really was decked out like a Christmas tree, and stood on the deck going, "Hello, I'm Admiral Nelson." So some people think that it was a deliberate act of of suicide or martyrdom so that he'd always be remembered. I don't know, it sounds...
It is astonishing. Nelson's column is, we're all used to it, I suppose, but at the time it must have been just the most bizarre memorial. Huge, way bigger than anyone else's. And do you think that people thought at the time, eyesore or great idea or what?
I seem to remember that the public outpouring of grief was just extraordinary. I mean, but isn't this the whole idea, which I think we cover in the show, is that he became a sort of a rallying point for popular sentiment after his death, which was why they kind of, the idea of him having one eye was he was painted as even more of a hero than he had in fact been, because he became almost became a sort of a mythological figure, was sort of manipulated as such by the politicians of the day.
The funny thing is, he was regarded as having won the Napoleonic Wars, wasn't he? Although Trafalgar was 10 years before Waterloo. Yeah. So I suppose saved the country is the idea.
And there's a huge amount of mythology, all the tipping the admiral and all that stuff.
Was he was part of the problem he had with the other admirals that he wasn't a toff? Was he a toff?
No, he was a vicar's son, wasn't he, from Norfolk, God's own county, as we know, the home of Stephen Fry.
Brilliant tactician.
So all the other admirals were toffs, I suppose, were they? Would that have been part of the problem?
I think definitely it would. He wasn't working class or anything. He'd been ordinary middle, poor gentry, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I've actually been to the village where he was born. It's very touching seeing the little church and the pub where he had his last drink and all that kind of stuff. It's like many of these lives. Hopefully, one day when we write the QI Book of the Dead, we'll capture some of the amazing sort of ironies and strangenesses of... There's no such thing as a perfect hero or a genius. Everybody's got flaws.
Yeah. And
he certainly had plenty of them. So, buzzing bees, and we start with a retraction.
Yeah, this is interesting. In fact, I think John Mitchinson covers this in the book of Animal Ignorance, which has come out just recently. But the
price $12.99, Faber and Faber.
That's damn good value. Good heavens. Anyway, we say in the show that bees do their buzzing through their spiracles, which are these holes along the sides of their bodies. But I think that has now been repudiated by some quite delicate experimentation, John. Is that right?
Yes, they're damn clever, these scientists, and what they've managed to do. They're 14. There's a rather attractive notion that the bees use these little 14 breathing holes along their sides, rather as a trumpeter uses his mouth as a sort of a valve to get different tones. But in fact, they've blocked them. And rather irritatingly, the bees still buzzed. So the best theory now really is that they use it's the vibration of the wings that's sort of amplified by the thorax. The thorax acts as a sort of a sound box. So you clip a bee's wings, doesn't stop the buzzing completely, but it changes its timbre and
interestingly, I suppose that's what most people would have assumed in the first place.
Yeah. So this is a classic case where general ignorance proves to be not, in fact, ignorant at all.
Well, that's right.
But the best thing that we came up with, which I think is also in the book somewhere, is this idea that bees, they've managed to demonstrate that bees recognise human faces. Which,
no.
Well, come on.
Yes.
No. This is the sparkle.
Honestly, this is the kind of thing that brings us into disrepute.
No. Well, this published in Nature. It's a rather good bit of research. But the problem is, what does that mean? I mean, it's very easy to say. What it actually means is that they respond. They recognise flowers. So if you take a photograph of a human face and you reward them with a bit of nectar on one face but not on another, they will naturally...
Well, they differentiate one face from... No,
yeah.
Absolute nonsense.
And they're very clever creatures. You've got to remember that the only creature that has a language that we can understand. There's no other creature. There are lots of theories about animal language, but we know what a bee is telling other bees. The waggle dance, we know that it's a very precise location of flowers. The thing about bees being able to talk, though, is they only ever have two subjects of conversation. Yeah. Where flowers with lots of nectar are, or where they're going to plant the next hive. No small talk. And also, taken out of context, a bee as a conversational partner, one-on-one, would be disappointing. But it is, I still think, astonishing, given they've got these tiny, weeny little brains.
Yes, and are they? Is it sort of a committee system they're running? Or are they? You think of bees as rather like ants, as being a very communal animal,
yeah,
and so that they're really sort of acting
organised.
as a, what's the word we use with the notorious bacteria? There was some, I can't remember what it was. Well, where there's a kind of collective,
like a sort of committee system.
Yeah.
I guess so. It's very hierarchical. I mean, and it's also controlled by hormones, as it is with ants.
I read an interesting thing that the drones are because they're laid by the queen from unfertilized eggs. The genetic consequence of that is that the workers have they're more closely related to each other than they are to their own female offspring. Which sounds stupid, but apparently that's the way the genetics works out, and that means that it kind of predisposes them towards this communal living. That they're predisposed towards helping their own siblings rather than trying to go off on adventures to produce their own descendants.
Every third mouthful of food we eat is we've got bees to thank. People often forget.
From pollination.
Yeah, because they're bloody important. And then there's, I suppose...
What was this thing about bees all dying out? Is that...
Yes, it's called hive collapse syndrome, which is basically they don't know. They think it's probably another virus. For years they've fought against the varroa mite, which has wiped out lots of colonies, but there are now treatments for that, but there does seem to be...
So this is a bee flu?
Yeah, I mean, again, not entirely clear about what's causing it. There are lots of.
The press kind of lost interest when it turned out not to be mobile phones, didn't they?
There's also a bee sex, of course, which I don't think is covered. But the fantastic thing, the queen's nuptial flight, when she's killed all the other queens in the hive, she pipes loudly. It's called quarking, and the other queens, while they're in their queen cells, quark in response, in which means that she either then stings them through the top of the cell and kills them, or rips them out and rips their heads off. She then flies off, and this extraordinary thing is that the drones congregate in various places, and some of them, Gilbert White of Selborne talks about a congregation of drones that is still 200 years later. That's where they still hang out. And she has mid-air sex with up to 15 of them, and the bees membran virilae explodes. I mean,
You mean cock, John? You can say cock. There's
the bee's phallus,
here.
the bee's cock. It basically explodes inside her, leaves what's called the mating sign, and it is a feeble attempt to plug in his own semen, and then he falls to the ground and dies a fairly painful death. But they get one shot, and then she comes back with enough sperm on board to fill the colony for several years.
Not many people know, perhaps, that Mick Jagger's a keen beekeeper. And in that famous song, "Well, I'm a king bee, baby, buzzing around your hive," he goes on to say, "I can make honey, baby, let me come inside." But what he doesn't know, well, he probably does know now, he's a keen beekeeper, is that male bees don't make honey. Isn't that right, John?
That is correct, yeah.
So, Mick, get your act together. Sorry, don't you like my Mick Jagger impersonation?
No, there's king termites, but no king bees. They're drones. Drones are like fat, hairy, useless. They get kicked. They're the first to be kicked out of the hive, because as Flash said, their only function is to pollinate, is to fertilise the queen.
Right.
You would think that the business about piping back to the queen would be deselected by evolution, because the ones that keep quiet are going to tend to survive longer, aren't they?
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. So much revolution again.
Yeah, rubbish. Yeah. Boo! So bees, more bee information here, we thought. Flashy.
Yeah, there's lots. I mean, we could have gone on forever about bees, but it's just one question. I think a rather unfair question, actually, because remember the question we ask in the show is who first discovered the world was round, which is a classic sort of QI unfair question. But anyway, there's this an area we didn't get into. Apitherapy, would it be, John? Apitherapy, where it's bee venom therapy, and it's been used since ancient times, and it seems to work. And what you do is you take a bee with a pair of tweezers and you hold it against someone's skin until he stings, and then you just hold it and you leave the stinger in for 10 or 15 minutes, and it injects this anti-inflammatory called melittin, and that prompts the body into producing cortisol, which is a natural healing agent. And I think it's not, mainstream, but it's not completely out in the sort of wilder areas of mad science either. It does seem to work. I can't say I'd want to have it done, though. Beekeepers
that I know always say that bee stings are very good with arthritis, probably the same thing.
Yeah, arthritis is one of the things, and I think period pain.
So, if you're keeping bees, you inevitably do get stung.
Yeah. Well, is it all these things like putting maggots into wounds? That definitely works.
There's a hospital in Bristol where they breed maggots for the World Maggot business, and
Yeah.
and they stick them into wounds. As you
And
say.
leeches are being used.
Leeches are huge,
Yeah,
absolutely.
being used all over.
So
Those
are we saying that medieval doctors were right all along?
some of them,
Again,
they were right, yes.
Top notch.
good bleeding.
The other thing about bees is honey, of course, which is the only edible secretion other than milk that we can take from animals without injuring them. And it doesn't go off. You know, there is honey that lasts because it's hygroscopic. It absorbs
Bird's
moisture.
nest soup
Bird's nest soup
is made
I
from
think you
the
find
spittle
Of the Asian cave swift.
Exactly, the
Congratulations.
Asian cave swift,
10
that's
points, flashy, Baylil.
But surely we are damaging them because we're taking away their nests, aren't we? Is that a secretion? Would you call a nest a secretion?
Yeah, but you're taking away the
No, the
honeycomb as
spittle.
well.
The spittle.
Good. Okay, I'll grant
No,
you.
the nest is made from spit. It's not made from twigs.
No twigs at all.
No, it's 100%
What
spittle.
Does the egg not fall down and smash though when you take it away?
Well, you can give them a nice box, an egg box.
Anyway, yes, there is ancient Egyptian honey, which is an extraordinary thing. If it's stored properly, it can last, if not forever, for a hell of a long time.
So when it says on the size of a jar of honey, best before,
but
the year 4000, should it be?
yeah, but this is a huge issue because for exactly that reason that because you have to say there has to be a best before date, and a lot of beekeepers get very cross about this.
Do they?
Yes, they do.
I think we know that
They're stunned by that.
elephants aren't frightened of mice, but they are frightened of bees. Is that right?
Yeah, well,
Yes,
in fact, our
hives.
friend Fritz Vollrath, the professor of elephantology, I guess, at Oxford, has done the research on this.
And I thought he was an arachnid man.
No, well, I know he's very keen on elephants because I've spoken to him about them. But anyway, the thing is that they use beehives like scarecrows. So if they've got some crops that they want to keep the elephants off, they'll hang a beehive up. And the elephants just run away from them because they've got very thick skin, but they've got thin skin under the belly and behind the ears and inside the trunk and things like that. And apparently you get entire flocks of elephants being chased by swarms of bees, maybe as far as 5
It's not a
kilometres.
flock of
It is,
elephants.
of course it's a flock of elephants.
It's a herd of bees and a flange of elephants.
Now, I like the idea that you didn't get honeybees in North America until the Europeans colonised it, and they were known by Native Americans as white man's flies. It's interesting.
That's very good. I like white man's flies. That's enough bees. Right, barnacles. Some extra information on those. Flash.
Well, I just thought it was worth raising the thing about keel hauling, which is a punishment, an ancient punishment from the Navy.
So a bit of a naval sub-theme in this series.
Yeah, we have a little bit, yeah. Somebody must have read a book. And what it is, the keel hauling was this punishment which involves the grotesque punishment, really, of attaching ropes to someone and pulling a sailor under the boat from one side, or in some cases from one end to the other. Obviously,
Well, that would be fatal. One end to the other.
yeah,
That
I
would-
think it was fatal on occasion. But anyway, what it's generally assumed, I think,
That's a little worse than exfoliating the...
Yeah.
Yes.
the exfoliation effect of all the barnacles that are along the bottom of the boat.
An encrustment of barnacles, by the way, I've just checked.
Exactly, a flock of barnacles along the bottom of the boat would actually have the effect of flaying the sailor alive. So
flanging him alive, possibly.
if he didn't drown, he died from the barnacles. And apparently that's not the case because, according to a book called Life in Nelson's Navy by Dudley Pope, they actually had weights attached to the feet so that when the guy was pulled under the boat from one side to the other, he was actually kept clear of the hull, precisely so as to avoid the barnacles tearing him to pieces, and of course stop him getting stuck against the hull. So it seems that whatever the purpose was of keel hauling, it was not to subject someone to a flaying by barnacle.
But they did keel haul people, though. They definitely did that.
It was never, curious enough, it was never ordered by a Royal Navy court-martial, although it does seem to have been used on a sort of improvised basis by some naval captains, even in the merchant service, actually. And the Dutch Navy did use it as an official punishment right up until 1813, we're told.
Very good. So the one thing we know about barnacles is they've got enormous cocks, I think, haven't they?
Yeah, they do.
Do you call them, is it a cock of a barnacle or something else?
It's all a bit, I suppose you could, penis, I suppose.
Or a membrum virilis.
Yeah, I think the thing about them is
But maybe this is the horrible thing about being keel-hauled, is lots of barnacles, Willie. It says, well,
the way they work, most of them are hermaphrodites. This is the thing. So they've got both.
Oh, no.
So they've got both bits going.
Keel-hauling is a disgusting experience.
To use terrible anthropomorphic language, when one barnacle decides to become its mother, as it were, it lays eggs inside its own shell and at the same time releases pheromones. And the nearby barnacle thinks hello, and
She's putting out.
and then it decides it plays male, fertilises the eggs, but extending its massive penis and releasing sperm into the captivity of the female. And it can be, 7 times longer than the body, which is, there's nothing else that comes close. Not even the legendary 9-banded armadillo comes close to that.
No. And the Spanish eat these things, don't they?
They certainly eat those ones. They call percebes, I think, those ones. They're sort of the long-necked goose barnacles, which I guess are the
It
ones
is the neck, or it is the long neck as well as it is.
And of course, Joe Brown mentions that in this show. And of course, there is the business about the goose barnacle, as you say, where barnacles were regarded as being where geese came from.
The Latin for Irish goose is Ansa hibernaculi, Hibernia being Latin for Ireland. This was shortened to bernicae, and by 1581, barnacle was used for both the geese and the shellfish. Confusion was widespread and persistent. This caused problems for the Irish Church. Some dioceses allowed the eating of geese on fast days because they're a kind of fish, others because they came from a bird-bearing tree and were not born of the flesh and therefore a kind of vegetable or nut. Others didn't, so papal intervention was required. Pope Innocent III finally banned goose eating on fast days in 1215. 400 years later, the Royal Society still carried accounts of wood laden with shells carrying the embryo of geese, and even Linnaeus gave some credence to the legend by naming 2 species of barnacle, Lepas anatifera, duck-bearing shellfish, and Lepas ancifera, goose-bearing shellfish.
So, if you've got anything more interesting to say on barnacles, please write to us at www.qi.com. Okay, retraction alert on the Dion Quins.
Well, just a quick one for you, John. Here, apparently, when we're talking about the Dion Quins in Canada, we say that Mike Harris was the Prime Minister of Canada, but in fact, he was the Premier of the province of Ontario and not the Prime Minister of the whole shooting match, which was at that time someone called Jean Chrétien.
That is so dull, I think I'm going to kill myself.
We've got to get it right, though, John.
Did we actually say that he was Prime Minister of Canada or just the Prime Minister?
I think we certainly implied he was the Canadian Prime Minister.
Okay. Yep. Well, we're very, very sorry about that.
Apologies to Jean Chrétien.
Bats and echolocation. Flash, you did the original research on this, I think. Please enlighten us.
Yes, it's very the more research is done on echolocation in bats, the more extraordinary it seems to be, and the more precise their ability is, and the way they can navigate their way by radar, basically through a hedge. To pick off an insect that's hiding inside it.
Through a hedge?
Yeah, apparently.
What, you mean they fly into the hedge and then sort of clamber through it? And
No, they can fly in where there's a whole lot of leaves.
They can tell the hardness of an object. It's so accurate that they can, it's hard for us to conceive, really.
Yes. And of course, this was regarded as...
Single thread of spider silk.
You're joking.
A single thread of spider silk 3 feet away.
And do they avoid us? Yeah, they don't go... Yeah.
Yes, they do.
Mm.
So anyway, of course, it's not very obvious idea, this. And the first work on it was done by this Italian scientist named Lazzaro Spallanzani in the late 18th century. And he did the experiment which we describe in the show of putting bats and owls into darkened rooms. And he found that both of them could navigate quite well in low light. And the bat could also navigate in complete darkness, but the owl bumped into things in complete darkness. So they were clearly using different systems. And as we say in the show, the way he ran this experiment was by hanging bells from the ceiling of this room, and found that the owls, when they're flying around, blundered into the bells, but the bats didn't. Anyway, there was a man named Charles Jurin, who was Swiss, who added to his work, and then Spallanzani carried on with new experiments and came up with this idea that bats could see with their ears. And it was regarded as such a ridiculous idea that it was rejected by everybody and abandoned as a line of inquiry for 150 years, and not picked up until, I think people don't realize this, till the 1930s, when there was a researcher at Harvard called Donald Griffin who who used, the much better experiments that were available to him with special microphones and things, and found the very high noises being made by the bats as echolocation tools, and concluded that was what they were doing. And it's only since the 1930s that we've known that. There are a few other species that do this, and particularly whales and things, and it's attributed to some other species, including humans in some way, but it's not at all conclusive. But the bats seem, are quite remarkable.
It's so clever, but what they do is they use the energy from as they flap, the energy from the stroke of their wings forces the little chirp out of their larynx. And it also, at the same time, they muffle their ears. So they have to muffle, because they're incredibly loud, 110 decibels, some of these ultrasound chirps that they're making. So they have to close their own ears to stop them deafening themselves. But it's all done, the flap and the chirp and the ear muffle all happen sort of simultaneously.
But Flashy, just going back to your research, you say that Spallanzani placed sacks over each bat's head.
Yes.
Were they very small sacks or very big bats?
I think tiny sacks.
Tiny sacks.
I haven't really got the information on that, but I think it was tiny sacks probably. And that was the second experiment he did, where he found that if you put a sack over a bat's head, it gets disorientated.
They're smart, though, aren't they? I mean, vampire bats, which I think we deal with in a later series, don't we? But I like the idea that they...
This is funny. The future already exists for us,
the future
doesn't it?
does already exist, but they... if they don't get blood over, I think it's only 2 nights it takes them, and they'll die. It's very relatively low energy food, blood. So they've developed a system whereby adult females feed one another. They even remember who's helped them and make sure that they get repaid first. It's one of the very...
Right, so are you saying that if you drink only blood, you will die?
No, I'm saying that you have to drink blood quite often in order to live.
Okay. Plenty of it, which is what you often see, again, in another film. The Dracula films, they have the number of virgins that get consumed,
to go through a lot of
accelerates
virgins.
towards the end of the film.
Bat guano, or shit, as I'm sure you'd prefer to call it, John, is there's a great fact that we discovered. It's used as very good.
Why would I prefer to call it bat shit?
I don't know, just,
Well, isn't there a guy named
keeping it
Guano?
real.
What does guano mean?
Guano means shit.
Well, then.
Sounds like a name
But
of an
it is
actor,
valuable
doesn't
as fertiliser. It's used to make gunpowder. But what I love is it's very nutritious. A quarter pound of it contains more protein and minerals than a Big Mac, which I love.
And they're both shit. No. Sorry, no, we didn't say that.
The other thing we didn't get onto on the show is this, I don't think anyway, is this idea that bats invented butterflies. Do you know about this?
Yes, I love it. It's true. It's really interesting.
I'm not sure that it's absolutely been established, but it's certainly a good hypothesis that that moths were trying to coexist at night, of course, with the bats, and that some of them developed a hearing system in their wings, which allows them to detect an incoming bat's echolocation pulses and therefore to get out of the way. But the ones who didn't do that, the moths who didn't do that, pursued a different evolutionary strategy to survive bat predation, which was to live during the day instead of the nocturnal like moths, and they became butterflies. And butterflies are, in the fossil record, much younger as a species than any of the moth species.
Yeah, they're sort of high octane performance moths, basically butterflies, because the moths are a steady, solid family saloon, whereas the butterflies are Formula One cars. They have to eat a lot of nectar to keep themselves going. And I've got at least 2 papers that show that there's a couple of species of the tiger moths that generate their own ultrasound clicks to block the bat's frequency. So as a bat,
they have a jamming
device. As the bat comes in, the chirps get louder, for them to get the accuracy of attack, and the moths actually jam it by creating their own ultrasound.
They could
clicks.
send back a signal implying that they were 2 inches to the right, or something like that. That would be great, wouldn't it? I have a lovely quote from the Venerable Bede. I don't know why, I just like this. And he said, life, like he probably had an accent, but I won't do it. He said, life is a beautiful and strange winged creature that appears at a window, flies swiftly through the banquet hall, and is gone.
Did they have windows in the 9th century?
Well, they did.
I think they had holes, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was actually an anecdote, that, I think, of somebody, I don't think it was ever quite a quote, but it is absolutely beautiful image, isn't it? The idea that's all we know of life is this brief flit through a warm,
And also the
smoky
implication
hall.
is that it was an image he was familiar with, sitting there in the hall having a carousing away, presumably. Bats were flying in and out through the windows.
It's interesting. The Old English was eye hole, eagthirl, which for eye door. That was what they called them. An unglazed hole.
Great. Right, a footnote on Olympic events. Over to you, Flash.
Yeah, well, I've just been looking into this, and it seems that, I don't know this, but until 1948, the Olympics wasn't just about sports, but they had medals for artistic categories in the categories of architecture and town planning, sculpture, relief, painting, literature, and music. And if you were entering in these categories, it had to be associated with sport. For example, you had to, the architecture had to be a sports stadium or something like that. And
Well, hang on. You're saying that town planning was an
town
Olympic
planning,
event?
I swear to God.
Well, what is that, a team
no.
team sport? Or?
You could get a gold Olympic medal for town planning, as long as it was like a sporting design. I swear to God. And if you go to the Olympic website, you can look up who won.
That's brilliant.
It wasn't always awarded, but they always held the event.
But oddly enough, I did some research on obscure Olympic events. In fact, earlier than the ones you've got, sort of 1912 to 1948, as you've said, for the QI Annual, which is an excellent book, $12.99 from Faber, out now.
You can't do a book like that for $12.99, surely, to go.
On that colour.
It is extraordinary. It's very, 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 very good value.
150,000 words.
Anyway, some great early Olympic events now no more, such as the long jump for horses, only held in 1900, which was won by a horse called Extra Dry with a jump of 20 feet and a quarter of an inch. It was a pretty poor effort because it was 2.63 metres short of the current world record for humans. Pathetic horse.
Pretty difficult to explain to the horse what it was trying to do, though.
Yeah.
You know that the very first time the Olympics after ancient Greece was used was Robert Dover's Cotswold Olympics, and the big thing there was shin kicking, and in order to they wore steel cap boots and toughened their shins apparently by hitting them with hammers first. And the only really interesting thing about this is the umpire of that was called the stickler, which is where we get the term stickler for pedant from.
Oh, really? Mm. It's a shin-kicking umpire in particular.
A shin-kicking umpire is where you get stickler from.
Did you know that the tug of war was an Olympic event for quite a long time? And it first became an Olympic event in 500 BC. And then it was 1904, 1900, 1906, 1908, 1912 and 1920.
Brilliant.
In 1908, all the medalists were British police teams. The City of London Police took gold, Liverpool Police took silver, and the Metropolitan Police took bronze. The Americans, the USA, who were beaten in seconds, accused the British of cheating, claiming their spiked police boots gave them an illegal advantage. So the British offered a rematch, wearing their socks, and still beat them. Hooray for us. That's when we were good at things.
Did you come up with that great fact? It was because cricket was very briefly, I think, only once an Olympic event.
1900, oddly. Yeah.
But cricket was played a lot. Americans are always saying how dull cricket is. In comparison to baseball, but in fact a lot of Americans used to play cricket, and the founding fathers of America, and it was in the 1780s John Adams told Congress that if leaders of cricket clubs could be called presidents, there was no reason why the leader of the United States could not have the same title. So you can get the president.
How amazing. That's a great fact. Yeah, let's have some poetry now, Flashy.
Should I do? Well, this is the great thing. De Coubertin, the Baron who was the founding father, in reality, of the modern Olympics, won an Olympic medal himself.
Inspired by much Wenlock, of course.
Yeah, exactly, yes. But he won an Olympic medal himself, and he won...
Town planning, wasn't it?
No,
It was a town planning medal.
Almost.
Bronze.
He won the poetry prize, and he got gold, and silver and bronze were not awarded that year, in 1912, for a thing called the Ode to Sport. And one of the weird things about this is he wrote it under a pseudonym, but the pseudonym was of two people. So De Coubertin wrote on the pseudonym Georges Horrod and Martin Eschbach. So it's quite a good idea, I think, if you're taking up a pseudonym to pretend to be two different people.
Two Germans as well.
And then probably what you do is get your agent to go in and say, you need bigger fees because there's two of you, and then you share it with yourself. Anyway, his ode to sport goes like this. It sounds to me like one of those wall painting slogans they used to have in China during the Cultural Revolution. But it goes, "Oh, sport, you are peace. You forge happy bonds between the peoples by drawing them together in reverence for strength, which is controlled, organized, and self-disciplined. Through you, the young of the entire world learn to respect one another, and thus the diversity of national traits becomes a source of generous and peaceful emulation.
Jawohl.
And that was gold.
Rausch, Rausch.
For heaven's sake. But funnily enough, the thing that eventually brought these artistic sections to a close wasn't that it was regarded as inappropriate or anything, but was the issue of amateurism, which was absolutely a fundamental issue for the athletes at the time. And it was found that almost all the competitors in the cultural events were professionals, because there aren't that many amateur architects or town planners.
A worrying idea, that. Yeah.
So
Amateur town planner.
and even if they were amateurs when they went in, they always went off and used the fact that they were Olympic medalists to go and get paid for designing a town somewhere. So they were abolished because of the professionalism issue. The oldest medalist in Olympic history is a man named John Copley, who got silver in 1948 in the engravings and etchings event at the age of 73. Although the second oldest is actually a genuine sportsman who was Oscar Svan, who was a Swedish rifle shooter who was 72 when he got his medal.
Marvellous. Thank you very much. Well, retraction alert. This programme is notable for having 2 retractions in it. Not a mistake, we make that often. Flashy.
Yes, the first thing is we seem to have gone off the rails a bit on the subject of Sitting Bull. The point that we're making is that his name was Jumping Badger, and it is true that he was... that was the name he started out life with. But a couple of people have pointed out various things that we said that aren't quite right on air. One is that Sitting Bull, we refer to him as Chief of the Sioux, and as being the man who defeated Custer at Little Bighorn. First of all, he wasn't a chief, he was a medicine man. The Sioux's chief was actually called Red Horse. And secondly, the Sioux were only about a third of that force, and they were mainly Lakota and Cheyenne, the leader of the Lakota being Crazy Horse, who was the sort of lead redskin at that battle.
Okay, now, may I just take you up on this, because I did this original research. I did know he was a medicine man and not the chief. And when Stephen said he was a chief, that was Stephen ad-libbing. And I thought, is it worth stopping him? It's not worth making a fuss. But a medicine man, we think, is, a bloke who dances around in a sort of silly wig. But actually, they were very important people. And he was...
Shaman.
Though he wasn't the military chief, he was the shaman and the spiritual law guru, and definitely a guy who would make major decisions. So it isn't actually that bad a mistake. And it's it's not a slip of the tongue to say Sitting Bull's real name was Jumping Badger, but we should technically have said it was what he was first called. They were both real names that he was genuinely called. But
yes, the point that's made by our correspondents is that Sioux apparently do routinely change their names all the time, and at any given moment your real name is whatever it is then. But I agree with your point. I mean,
yeah, but he was called Jumping Badger, and he was called Sitting Bull. He
was also called Slow, apparently.
Yeah.
Which might mean something like carefully considering, that kind of thing, because he was apparently used to think before speaking. That was his name in middle life.
I think we also got some things on different types of Sioux that you mentioned earlier on.
Yes, Sitting Bull was a hunk papa, Red Horse was a mini conju, and Crazy Horse was an oglala. And I don't know, just subdivisions that I know nothing about, I'm afraid.
Well, that's thanks to Ali on the website.
Yeah, quite right. I think your prep school had houses named after Indian tribes, didn't they?
I was at Dulwich College Preparatory School, yes, in about 1902 when I was 7. And the 4 houses were supposedly named after different, what we would have called in those days, Red Indian tribes, now Native American ethnic subgroupings, perhaps. And 2 of the houses, I was in Chipaway, and one of the other houses was called Ojibwa, so Ojibwa and Chipaway. But actually it turns out that that's exactly the same. They're just different pronunciations of the same tribe. And you can say this by going Ojibwa, Ojibwe, Ojibwe, Ojibwa. It's exactly the same thing. So somebody ought to correct that, really.
Yeah.
Flobberdob.
Yes, the second retraction is we say that language spoken by Bill and Ben was this flobberdob, and it came about because it was the sound of Hilda Brabant's younger brothers farting in the bath. And we got a retraction on that from a very good source, Silas Hawkins, the son of the actor Peter Hawkins. And he says, he points out that the story was first printed about 20 years ago in a newspaper article, and that his father, Peter Hawkins, immediately wrote a rebuttal, which unfortunately, when we were writing this, we didn't find. So as the younger Mr. Hawkins says, it may be quite interesting, but in this case, it just isn't true. Their language is called oddle-poddle, apparently, and in flobberlob actually means flower pot in oddle-poddle.
The elf responsible has already been dismissed. So, buffalo and bison, what's the difference? John Mitch.
Of course, you can't wash your hands in a bison.
No, you can't wash your... No.
No,
You can't wash your hands
In a bison.
buffalo.
Oh, buffalo.
You can wash your
I
hands
get
in a
it now,
bison.
yes.
Oh.
Yes, very good, very droll. It's a terrible, terrible story, though. Bison. And the other thing is, the species name is I think it's still quite amusing, like bison, bison, bison.
Yeah.
But
That's a better poem than Baron Coubertin's one, isn't it?
It is.
Bison, bison, bison. Keep those bison, bison.
But there were a lot of them, and then there were almost none. There were 70 million, they thought, at one point, beginning of the 19th century. And by 1890, basically in 50 years, they think 70 million bison were killed. Just extraordinary. It was
Just by hunting?
It was the
And
workmen
lots of
building. It
habitat
was the
there.
workmen building the railways. That was the thing.
And did they hunt them to eat them, or
They did, and then it became sport. The two things happened. One was first of all they were shot. The railway workers who were building the great iron roads across America needed them for meat, and then the British Army decided that so-called buffalo leather, although it was in fact bison, made the best boots. So they were offered $2 a hide. Buffalo hide or a bison hide was a robe, or 25 cents for a ton. So, and they could kill. I mean, the big Wyatt Earp, Buffalo Bill, Cody. They could kill 100 of these things in an hour. And there were stories, terrible stories, as they were going through the herds that people, ordinary kind of, shooting them from fun from a moving train became a sort of a great lark. And they reckon the whole of the slaughter generated about 20 million over a sort of 50 years. Generated about $20 million. So 28 cents an animal. So it was not even terribly profitable. So only 1 in 5 was actually put to commercial use. The rest just rotted. And you've got these terrible photographs of them, just piles and piles of them just rotting on the ground. And of course, that led to, as a sort of specieside, also led to genocide, because the indigenous tribes that relied on them were, every aspect of their livelihood was based around the bison, and no bison, it became even harder. So
was that like Eskimos and seals? Or whatever they used?
It's very
what did they use?
So they ethnically cleansed the prairie lands. So that, the prairies, and of course the other problem with the prairie lands is that they were fertilised by bison urine. I mean, that was what made them fertile. So the whole thing was a complete disaster. Anyway, now there are 350,000. The 700 or so that were left have recovered. And it's supposed to be fairly healthy meat, bison meat, buffalo meat. Cattle and bison hybrids are bred for eating. They're called catalo and beefalo.
Yes, there's an interesting thing about how the Indians used to hunt the buffalo before the guns arrived. And in the 1870s, the Blackfoot Indians of Montana were still hunting bison by luring them over the cliff. And you can see cave paintings in Europe of the same technique being used going back as far as 30,000 BC.
For reindeer.
Yeah, and there's a guy named George Bird Grinnell who wrote an eyewitness account of a medicine man would put on a bison headdress and then attract the attention of the herd, and he would walk towards a sort of funnel of rocks that they created, and the herd would follow him, apparently. And then once the herd was in this funnel, the other Indians would jump up from behind the rocks and shout at them and stampede them over the side of the cliff.
I love because there are European bison, although not very many of them, and I think they only survived because they're still farmed, but they're called the wisent. But in medieval bestiaries, the European bison was called the bonacon, or wilde cow, and it traditionally defended itself by spraying a jet of excrement over a distance of 80 yards. So there are these fantastic illuminated manuscripts of these bison with the sort of exploding backsides. Not, I think, based on direct observation.
So, Billy the Kid. Should we talk about Billy the Kid?
Yes, John, let's. There's one thing that we didn't put in the show, which I think is rather curious. I think anyone who it's likely that you think that Billy the Kid's real name was William H. Bonney. That's what you seem to read in the books. But in fact, it turns out that was just another of the aliases he used, and his real name, or the one he was born with, anyway, is Henry.
Thank you. You see,
well,
it's easy to make that mistake.
He was called Henry McCarty, and he was born in New York in 1859.
That's right. His mother was a sort of a washerwoman, laundress. And they moved out to Wichita in Kansas in 1870. In Wichita, according to a contemporary newspaper, pistols were as thick as blackberries.
And we make a reference to, in the show, the context of this is that it was his death warrant was written by General Lew Wallace, who also wrote Ben-Hur, and was the governor of New Mexico. And in fact, the Kid's official death warrant is in Wallace's own handwriting. That's the point. I don't think it really comes out in the show. But
I think there's also a little retraction that we ought to make that we don't think we made it on the show, but we certainly did put it in the Book of General Ignorance, that they say that Billy the Kid is the real-life person who's been most depicted in films. He's portrayed in at least 46 movies. And I think at last count, Napoleon had been portrayed in something like 320, so...
yes, that seemed a very thin idea. Good retraction. But isn't there something rather wonderful about the death warrant of Billy the Kid, an iconic fictional character?
Fictional?
What?
Fictional?
What did I say?
You said he was fictional.
Well, all right, yes, right. In the sense that it wasn't his real name. No, that an iconic, sort of a legendary figure like Billy the Kid, his death warrant was signed by the guy who wrote Ben-Hur. That seems to be rather wonderful. Yeah. You wonder why General Wallace didn't write cowboy thrillers rather than...
Well, that's what Alan says in the show. He says, what's he do? Why is he writing about Romans? You know? Yeah.
I like the idea, though, that Billy the Kid was only known as Billy the Kid right at the end of his life. Until then, he'd always just been known as the Kid, which is...
Yeah. There's some question, apparently, over whether he was really killed. You know, this thing with Pat Garrett's very famous.
There was the guy who claimed to be him.
Yeah, who died in the 40s, I think.
That's right, came out of the woodwork.
What was his name?
Brushy Bill.
He's called Brushy Bill Roberts, was his name. And he claimed to be...
But it's not completely bogus. Well, it may be completely bogus, but in 1903, the governor of New Mexico at that time did have the case officially reopened to establish whether Billy the Kid had really died and whether, in fact, he deserved a pardon because, he had received this amnesty, which was then reneged on.
It just to show how all this weaves together so beautifully, it was Brushy Bill Roberts was part of Buffalo Bill, the Bison Killer's Wild West show.
It all just comes around, doesn't it, John?
It does.
Yeah.
Fascinating, thank you. The truth behind snake charming. Flashy. Enlighten us.
I've got to confess, I've never seen a snake charming act. Has either of you ever seen one?
No.
They do exist, apparently, still. And in a sense, a con, I suppose. There are several things here. One is that the snakes aren't dancing to the music. I think that's what we mention on the show, that what they're responding to is the visual stimulus of the pipe, which is waved from side to side by the charmer. The cobras, which are the snakes used for this, all have this characteristic of standing up when they're startled or when they're trying to address a threat. They're defensive, not aggressive animals. So what they do is when they perceive a threat, they stand up about a third of their length and they make themselves look as big as they can by standing and by spreading their hoods out. And that's a defensive posture. So they'll do this thing of appearing to dance and not attack the charmer because it's not in their nature to attack, except as a last resort. The next thing is that when they do attack, if and when they do attack, they have a method of striking which involves striking straight downwards, as though if you put your elbow on a table and then smack downwards, I can't show you on the microphone here, but down with your fingers, you can see that your range is limited to the length of your forearm, and that's also the case for cobras. Whereas there are other snakes, such as the vipers, which includes rattlesnakes, which strike outwards. They can sort of push forward as they strike, so they're more dangerous in that respect. Thirdly, the charmer, the bite isn't necessarily fatal. But the next thing is that the charmer is very often, in any case, taking the fangs out and in some cases has even taken the whole of the jawbone, which holds the fangs, out of the snake, which normally has the result of killing the snake eventually. And some apparently even go to the point of sewing the snake's mouth shut so that they can't bite whatever happens. And of course, in due course, they starve, and then the snake charmer just goes out and catches another one. So it does seem to be a con pretty much from top to bottom. I should like to see the act, but it sounds as though it involves some pretty unsavoury practices.
Yeah. I think I found out the other day, which is actually in the Book of Animal Ignorance, $12.99, Faber and Faber, out now, very good value.
$12.99 again.
It is.
You've strange that price point thing, haven't you? Yeah.
But did you know that nobody's born with a fear of snakes? It has to be learned. In fact, I think human beings are born with only two natural fears. That's loud noises and falling. So people are frightened of snakes. Where do they get that from? My wife is frightened of snakes. I shouldn't even mention that. She won't speak to me now for a week.
Yeah, there are some people who are actually, in an Indiana Jones way, crippled by fear of snakes, aren't they? They can't see anything, even a plastic one, even if they know it's a plastic
Angus
one.
Deaton,
Yeah,
famously.
exactly.
Angus Deaton is absolutely terrified of them, yeah. But you mentioned that cobras are defensive, not aggressive. In fact, no snakes are really aggressive. I think they're all really would prefer to run away if possible.
I read somewhere the other day that there are lots of vipers in this country, in Britain. They're quite a common animal. It's just you never ever see them because they always scarper.
Is that the same as an adder?
You mean an adder?
Is a viper the same as an adder?
Yeah, yeah. Why didn't the viper nose? Because he had a red handkerchief? One must have heard that.
W.C. Fields' is famous cure for snakebite. Always carry a large flagon of whiskey in case of snakebite. Furthermore, always carry a small snake. They have two penises, of course. We can't let that go by.
My dear chap, don't we all?
And the one on the right is often larger, which makes people think that they might be right-penised in the same way that most humans are right-handed.
And also, they'll explode if given Alka-Seltzer. I'd like to try that.
Because it's powerful hydrochloric acid, can't they? They can digest pretty much anything. Steel balls, I remember, was one of the things.
Steel balls, but not Alka-Seltzer?
Well, because it reacts with the acid, obviously,
okay.
and creates a gas of...
Ugh, what a horrible idea. What do you do in the rare event that a snake chases after you, which is not going to happen, frankly, but if it does, do you know what the top speed of a rattlesnake is? Terrifying.
Oh,
2 miles an hour.
You're not serious.
Yes, you walk briskly away.
The fastest snake ever recorded clocked in at about... There's a black mamba, famously very fast.
10 miles an hour?
10 miles an hour.
But that's new. I thought it was 7 miles an hour. I think you corrected that. So it must be very, very new information. Perhaps they've evolved to be faster, black mambas.
Yes.
Because the slow ones have all been killed. There you are, you see.
It's happening all around us. Evolution.
Evolution.
Actually, I knew it would turn out to be the right thing in the end.
Yeah.
And this
Very,
slightly links to the next thing, but snakes can taste air and see heat.
Synesthesia.
Which brings...
Well, just coming up to 12:13 and the traffic news from Flashy on synesthesia.
Yeah, see, we covered synesthesia. It's a fascinating subject and one we didn't go into in great depth, although we spent a little bit of time on it. But because we've got not just 5 senses, but as you know, many more senses than that, there are just endless ways you can mix them up. And synesthesia is the business of mixing up senses where one sense leads to a sensation that belongs really with another sense, such as seeing music in terms of colours. A lot of people seem to have this thing about an association of the days of the week.
I do that. Let's do that. What colours are yours?
Well, I don't have it at all.
How about you, John?
Yes, definitely. Weekends are red for me.
Yeah, but the thing is, there's a distinction which scientists are quite careful about between, an analogy that you've created over time and an actual involuntary and permanent thing.
Yes, I definitely have it. I don't have much synesthesia.
Thursdays are yellow.
Well, I've got Mondays are red, Tuesdays are blue, Wednesdays are green, Thursdays are brown, Fridays are yellow.
So if we'd asked you that, when you were 17, would you have given the same answer?
Absolutely. I'm completely stuck on that.
Yeah.
So I relate to this synesthesia thing, and it is really, really interesting. Now, do you think it's a kind of some sort of wiring in the brain, the sort of cross the circuits have got crossed in some way.
Well, I think that's one of the key research issues, is whether this is physiological or psychological.
Well, some believe that we all have it, but we, like lots of things, we sort of lose it as we get older. Can't quite see what the point of having it as a small child is, but that maybe it's a bit like sort of bones growing and forming.
I think that people who don't have it, you're one, Flash, it's impossible to convince people who aren't prey to these things that they're real, really. You think, oh, no, it's just there's a rational explanation. For example, Garrick, one of our researchers, had an out-of-body experience. Do you ever hear that story?
I think you told me, yeah.
Yeah. He's absolutely knows it's true, and other people, no, but you must have dreamt it, Garrick. No, I know I didn't dream it. And, for example, I'm slightly telepathic, so nobody can tell me that telepathy doesn't exist.
I knew you were going to say that, though.
Did you know in the Sufi faith, who are a kind of offshoot of Islam, some people say predate Islam, in fact, that Sufis all believe in telepathy, but they mainly use their powers, and they do have these telepathic powers, Sufi masters, to send out signals that telepathy doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So that's what you're picking up. Yeah. Back to synesthesia.
The problem I have with synesthesia, in your sense, is that things like days of the week are an artificial construct. It's a rational construct. So how can that be hardwired?
So it's not. Yes, I see. Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? I can understand associating sounds with colours, for example. I can't understand it, but I can sort of, it's easier to get behind as an idea.
I can sort of see, yes, that I think is it John Locke, the blind man, who associates scarlet with the sound of a trumpet.
Yeah, we should say John Locke's not a blind man. John Locke wrote about a blind man.
No, he was writing about a blind man.
Yes. That's the earliest clear reference to synesthesia we found in the literature. It may be mentioned by ancient Greeks and other people, but yeah, and it is something that's experimented on. There are various people great artists who are supposed to have had it, mainly musicians, come up in the list for starters: Rimsky-Korsakov, Messiaen, Kandinsky, a painter, Hockney, Eisenstein, Baudelaire.
Seems to go along then. Would you say that it's kind of connected to creativity in some way?
Well, it's tempting to think that, but it seems to be quite widespread. So they say that as many as 1 in 2,000 people have some form of synesthesia. 1 in 5,000 of those have the colour letter thing, the thing associating colours with letters. And 1 in 15,000 have the one which we associate taste with touch, for example. So I guess it's not really, the people sometimes associate, say, left-handedness with creativity, and presumably that doesn't really stack up if you do the numbers. It doesn't sound to me as though synesthesia does either. It's just that synesthetes, when they're artists, you hear about them.
Do we think that synesthesia is a gift or more like a disability?
Sounds to me like it sounds to me like it's a gift which could, say, for instance, like having a very good memory can become a disability if you're unable to filter it.
And what about having very good taste buds, for example? I've only got one left, but say a master of wine, do you think they're assailed continually by the ghastliness of, an ill-made cup of tea or a slightly off?
It's an interesting
milk
point whether you can sort of train, if you're, when you're talking about wine, it's very difficult to talk about taste, except in terms of other senses.
It's inherently synesthetic, the language of wine tasting.
Yeah, one wonders if it's just purely metaphorical, or whether actually after a period of time because you're focusing so much attention on that part of your brain that your other senses are sort of starting to leak into it.
I went to a whiskey tasting once in Scotland with somebody who was very, very articulate and interesting. I love whiskey, but all those things, the notes in a whiskey, and seeing that it's got this sort of flavour and a bit of this, and was fascinating, really. So I wonder if synesthesia is the sort of thing that those people are more developed in some way.
Or if you look at animals like moles or the platypus, which has this extraordinary electric sensor for its, the bill of the platypus, and you look at then the corresponding size of the part of the brain that processes that information is really much larger. So whether there is a way in which experience whether you can sort of induce synesthesia by focusing on a particular sensual experience. It's very interesting.
The range of possible feelings that people get, we can sort of listen to other people talking about logical things and so on. But when, for example, people who cry a lot at music, it's not something that I ever do. If I hear a great violin concerto. Do you find that? Do you find you're attuned in that way?
No, only by association of ideas sometimes. You can associate a particular song with, there's a famous video of Sinead O'Connor crying when she sings Nothing Compares to You, and she presumably had to assume that she was thinking about something that song meant to her, then that was what made her cry.
It's a very good song, isn't it?
Yeah.
Rather affecting.
And we all have the thing of cut grass and cricket, for example. But that can't be synesthesia. That's a learned association, isn't it?
Yeah.
Cricket induces screaming terror and the smell of sweat and feces.
Okay, well, that's awkward. Or the old jock straps, you mean. That's another learned association, is what I'm saying.
Larger boys in the changing rooms. And so, in the spirit of Christmas, a warm glow of cavils, quibbles, retractions and moans, and generally getting things you didn't want, masterminded by Santa Fletcher.
We've got one retraction, really, one major retraction and a couple of little quibbles on this show. The retraction was first brought to our attention by Howard Goodall, actually, who wrote the theme tune. Yeah, a great musician and very interested in sound, and it concerns this business about helium. And Stephen says, I think under pressure, actually, he says, the fact is sound travels faster in helium, which increases the frequency but not the pitch.
Oh dear,
goodness sake. And I remember we all thought, Stephen, please, come on. Anyway, we've had Howard, and a couple of physicists have written in and said that basically that's nonsense, because pitch and frequency are the same thing to all intents and purposes. And what happens is the frequency stays constant, because that's set up by the vocal folds, the physical windpipe, and that stays the same. And it's the wavelength of the sound that increases. And since the speed of sound in helium is greater than in ordinary air, the frequencies are higher. So the overall effect is that the fundamental note, which is the pitch of what you're saying, stays the same, but it's accompanied by higher frequency harmonics, because as you know, your voice consists of many different frequencies. And the harmonics change, and that gives rise to this change in timbre that Stephen refers to. So we've had that from Albert Hickson and our own Dr. Bob, who posts on the website for us. And we seem to have got that into so we're in a slight muddle about the physics of the way we describe that in the show, although the basic point that the pitch doesn't rise is right.
Well, thank you very much, Albert Hickson and Dr. Bob, for filling us in there.
Helium's interesting stuff, though. I mean, before we leave that, because it's the second most common element in the universe, apparently, but it's very rare on Earth, and almost all of it is in western Texas. And it was first discovered...
hot air in western Texas.
No, it's mined. That's the thing.
Yeah, they mine it.
Helium mines. How weird is that? They dig it out of the ground.
And then send it off to balloon factories all over the world. But I wonder if they put it in the balloons for transporting it. Or maybe that's how they transport it.
They mine it as a gas or in some sort of weird...
It comes as a byproduct of oil mining, I think.
I see.
Or oil drilling.
Great.
But it was found first in space in the during
they're called helium wells. Yeah. Isn't that fabulous? Like an oil well.
In 1868, they did a spectroscopic analysis of the sun during a solar eclipse, and discovered this stuff that was coming from the sun, helios, and that's why they call it helium. But they didn't find any at all on Earth for another 27 years after that. And so what they did about party balloons until about 1900, goodness alone knows.
Yes, it's fascinating, isn't it, that what percentage of the universe is made of hydrogen is the other one, isn't it? Hydrogen and helium account for more than 90% of the universe, certainly, which is extraordinary.
Well, helium is 25%.
Is it?
Yeah, on its own.
Well, how extraordinary. So, more quibbles on King Herod.
Well, this is just a quickie, really. We asked the question, what was Herod's wife called? And some people wrote and pointed out, I think, strictly speaking, rightly, that it was a bit like saying, what's King Henry's wife called? Because there were several King Herods, and one of them had lots of wives. But we were talking about the one who's normally called Herod the Great. His first wife was called Doris, which is the slightly feeble joke that we thought we were after. Doris was also...
What's feeble about that joke? That was a very good joke.
Doris was also the name for Achilles' grandmother, as it happens. So quite a common name in antiquity.
Very funny.
Anyway, he divorced her and married someone called Mariam, who he later killed. And in fact, he had 10 wives, that particular Herod, and he was a psychopath by all accounts. That's all, really.
Well, there we are. So it was King Herod the Great's first wife was called Doris. Well, there's a feast of quibbles for Christmas lunch today, and here's another one.
Well, this is perhaps even more footling. There was we talk about the coldest thing in the universe being this bar that has been chilled to almost 0 degrees, absolute zero in effect, and that's in Baton Rouge in Louisiana. And a couple of days after we recorded that, we found another very similar block of metal, which is in Italy, which is a footling quibble. But there is, since then, there's been more work done, and some gas, sodium in fact, has been now cooled to the lowest temperature ever recorded anywhere, which is 0.5 billionth of a degree above absolute zero.
Except for Helsinki, where they've managed to get a...
have they got even lower?
A bit of rhodium down to 1/10 of a billionth of a degree.
Haven't these people got anything better to do?
Although there seems to be a bit of quibbling about this, because they're basically the MIT and the Helsinki. They're both institutes of technology, but both call themselves the coolest places in the universe. But it does seem the low temperature lab in Helsinki. And I don't really understand this. It was a temperature of one particular type of motion, which is a quantum property called nuclear spin. So not, as they say, the overall average thermodynamic temperature for all possible degrees of freedom.
But what I think is great about this is
that it's
in
cold.
the end,
If you think it is, that's colder than that is very, very close to absolute zero.
Yeah.
And colder than anywhere else in the universe.
Yeah. So they say that it's not possible there can be anywhere else that cold unless another intelligent races, species has
Do you know
created
what
it.
the coldest place in the universe is, though? This is quite clever. But so far recorded is the Boomerang Nebula. It's colder, 2 degrees colder than the rest of space around it, because it's basically that it's spraying out gas at a speed of about 5,000 kilometres an hour. So it's the same as for about 1,500 years, they think. So just as our breath cools if we blow it through a narrow aperture, it's enough to cool it. But that's the lowest that they found.
What I think is interesting about this, though, is you can imagine that they've got to put this super cool stuff in a container, in a jar, and presumably the jar, isn't going to be cold itself. And the way they do it is by creating a sort of virtual container which is magnetic. Doesn't exist. It's
very interesting.
It's magnets holding the gas in this super cool state in the middle. And
how weird is that? Magnets holding a gas. How does that work?
I know.
But
it also implies that you could have a really good...
Beaker, isn't it? It's the Bose-Einstein constant. Bose-Einstein constant.
Bose-Einstein
Condensate.
for goodness sake.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But it starts very weird things start to happen at those low temperatures.
Yes, but just to finish what I was saying.
Sorry.
I was just thinking that the idea of a magnetic container sounds as though it's something you ought to be able to do more with. Like the world's best beer glass, for example, hold it for, how you pour the beer into the glass warms it up, however cold the glass is, even if you keep it in the fridge. If you could make somehow a magnetic container for beer.
Oh, that'd be fantastic.
Wouldn't that be great? You could sell a parcel of those.
Well, even it would cool the beer down, is that what you're saying?
It might even cool down, certainly wouldn't make it get any hotter.
I remember.
And you could stick it to the fridge.
That's very good.
Well, the reason I bring up this is because of your glass analogy. Is apparently you can't keep the very once this matter is at very low temperatures, it just debeakers itself. So it's a sort of it starts to behave in a completely different quantum way.
So you say they're going to be factory difficulties, are there?
It could be manufacturing difficulties.
Okay.
There's maglev trains. I do remember being about 9 or 10, and that first thing when you discover that amazing power of 2 magnets. This is the weirdest thing. Goethe said, magnetism, now explain that to me. There is no greater mystery except for love and hate. It's fascinating.
And gravity.
Yeah, and gravity. Well, gravity, magnetism, exactly. But I've got a book recently where somebody's pointing out what powers a magnet. Battery runs out. Engines have to be refueled. What's the thing that keeps that magnetism going? It really is the most extraordinary thing. And I can remember trying this out and thinking they ought to do this with trains. They ought to. It rests on a cushion of.
And then they did.
And they pinched my idea.
Your idea.
But the other thing is that so we know absolute zero is minus 273 degrees C, and that is called absolute zero because it's the speed at which molecules stop moving. So you can't get colder than that.
Yeah.
But there's no upper limit on hotness, is there? They haven't found absolute hotness yet. And will they? Can they?
Very good point.
But isn't it interesting that there's the speed of light is in a vacuum is an absolute, and coldness is an absolute, but heat isn't. So what's the speed of darkness?
It's getting a bit philosophical, that, but I suppose perhaps the hottest you can be is if the particles are moving at the speed of light.
That's very good.
It's a speculation.
That is flashy. You've invented something, I think.
I have, absolutely.
Apart from knowing where the coldest bar in the universe is.
Which is in Helsinki or
Rome or Baton
Massachusetts.
Rouge.
Or wherever.
No, it's in West Hendred.
That's very good.
Well, a very, very happy Christmas to all of you, and thank you so much for listening.